Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, November 2nd. This is day 27 since the October 7th attacks by Hamas into South Israel. There's a lot I could share. I could tell you about the internationals who just have been released through Rafah. They've been allowed out. One of the things that was a bit of an exchange and a negotiation is that 345 foreign passport holders were allowed out through the Rafah crossing into Egypt. And 81 wounded Palestinians were allowed out and were taken to an Egyptian field hospital. The expectation is that about 500 a day, I believe, foreign passport holders will be allowed out. There was a big conversation in the State Department readout between the news and the spokesperson for the U.S. State Department about who's controlling the Rafah border on the inside of Gaza, and it continues to be Hamas. And of course, the humanitarian assistance on the outside, on the Egypt side, is negotiated between Israel, Egypt. The U.S. is a part of that as well. Large concerns about hospitals in Gaza. On November 1st, the Turkish Palestinian Friendship Hospital reported that it ran out of fuel. There are 70 patients there who are cancer patients who have serious life risks because the hospital can't serve them. There are reports of hospitals being struck by shelling, including the Al-Hilo Hospital, which is in Gaza City. It also absorbed and replaced the Shifa Hospital's maternity ward, and it's being used to treat the wounded. 14 of 35 hospitals with inpatient capacities across Gaza are not functioning. This is the 27th day of hostilities. Since Israel didn't declare war till the next day, some say it's the 26th day of hostilities. Another nearly 300 Palestinians were killed. You heard about the attack on the Jabalia refugee camp, which many around the world were saying was a human rights violation because the number of civilians, several hundred. I woke up this morning and heard that refugee camp was attacked a second time this morning. The total number of hostilities, the total number of fatalities in Gaza since the start of hostilities is now 8,800, with roughly 2/3 being women and children. Humanitarian aid, we're not making that much progress. The total number of trucks as of November 1st has been 227, and yesterday a total of 10 trucks with water, food, and medicine was allowed in. And the UN, their relief coordinator, said this is nowhere near enough, which we know, and we need to tell the White House that. CMEP, Churches for Middle East Peace, and our membership coalitions are changing our strategy a bit. Statements are not enough. I know many of you are participating in protests. We are calling for a ceasefire. If you have not taken our action alert, please do today at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time, led by a number of Catholic groups, and CMEP's Catholic Advisory Council is a part of this as well. I know our head of DC office, Kyle Christophalo, is also participating. There is a pray-in at the White House, and there is an opportunity, and we will have more opportunities like this, for people to go to the White House to take, there's an invitation to take action and to pray and to exercise civil disobedience. People can pray and they don't have to have civil disobedience, but some people there are risking the possibility of arrest, to call attention to the deaths of the number of people in Gaza and the disproportionate effect on civilians. Rocket fire does continue into Israel. The death toll there is roughly the same, about 1,400. We do know that a number of soldiers who were a part of the ground incursion have been killed as well. 4 hostages have been released. You've heard that before. And then a 5th soldier was rescued by Israeli soldiers. I'm trying to just summarize some of the facts before I talk to you about what I really want to talk to you about, which has to do with, this moment. What do we do in this moment? The White House is not listening. I've mentioned before that October 7th was catastrophic for the Jewish people. Taught your whole life and seen throughout history that the Jewish people, we read in the book of Esther about the desire for Jewish people to be eradicated, and Queen Esther saves the Jewish people. And we see this throughout history, the Inquisition and, or the Middle Ages and the Inquisition. And we see this in the 19th century pogroms from Russia, and of course, culminating in the Holocaust. And October 7th further entrenched this fear for people, Jews living in Israel and around the world, that Jewish people are not safe. And friends, I want you to know anti-Semitism is real. We do need to differentiate between criticism of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism. But I wanted to read to you something from a friend of mine from Israel who was talking about how he's so concerned about anti-Semitism in the US and abroad. And he said, I think it is very dangerous to identify the Palestinian cause with Hamas and hatred of Jews, which, certainly we are not doing, but some around the world are. And he said this, Iran and Hamas deeply want to make this a religious war and a clash of civilizations. And many in Israel, there is a fundamentalist regime in Israel would have no problem with that. They would accept that just fine. But it is wrong and dangerous. Israel has to defend itself from real genocidal threats orchestrated by Iran and to prevent murderous, violent actions and theologies against the Palestinian people. I just want to read that again because I want us to hear, different perspectives to try to understand what's happening. Israel has to defend itself from real genocidal threats orchestrated by Iran and to prevent murderous, violent actions and theologies against the Palestinian people. This person who I am talking about is courageous, is an incredible Jewish Israeli. I have mentioned that in Israel right now, there is very, very little room to call for a ceasefire. But I want us to understand that many, many, if not most people in Israel believe that Jewish people in Israel and that the nation state of Israel is under threat of being annihilated by the surrounding Arab states, by not that Hamas has the capacity, but Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran. Historically, over the decades, the surrounding Arab states have not acknowledged Israel's right to exist. And, Hamas historically has said they would acknowledge Israel's right to exist. That has happened at least once in history. But many in Israel would say, we don't trust that at all. Look what happened on October 7th. And we need to hear that. I think that's critically important to understand. And at the same time, the most important thing in my perspective right now, and I pray that God gives us wisdom and discernment, the most important thing is that people stop dying and that people are safe. And as Gaza is being bombed and as Gaza continues to be shut off from potable water, electricity, and food, we're going to hit a tipping point where disease is going to spread rampantly, where people are going to start to die from malnutrition. I told you a few days ago, a major warehouse, an UNRWA warehouse was broken into where wheat and aid supplies was stolen. And so we're starting to see unrest in certain parts of Gaza. We're starting to see that the north of Gaza, those who did not evacuate, are completely cut off. And so what I wanted us to just talk about for a minute, and I am speaking for myself right now, I am not speaking for Churches for Middle East Peace. We have to talk about what is it going to take to stop the killing of people in Gaza. First, by cutting off water and humanitarian assistance and aid. Only 200 and some trucks have been allowed in so far. The UN is saying it was more than 500 trucks a day to prevent malnutrition before the war. Now we're in the 26th day of the war, or the 27th day of the war, and only 200 some trucks have been allowed in. Blinken is on his way on Friday to go to Israel and to go to Jordan. You probably heard Jordan pulled their ambassador from Israel, and they asked the Israeli ambassador to stay out of the country of Jordan. Other countries around the world are severing diplomatic ties, or they're pulling their ambassador. That happened in Bolivia, some other Latin American countries. There's, questions about Turkey, etc. Secretary of State Blinken is on his way to Israel, and some of his messaging has to do with we stand with Israel. Israel has a right to protect itself. A part of his messaging is that Israel has to act according to international humanitarian law. They are not. There's no question. Experts at the State Department have quit because U.S. weapons are being used in the violation of human rights. So part of what we have to do, this is why I was saying CMEP is changing its strategy. We've been talking about calling for a ceasefire with your elected officials. One of the things we're talking about at CMEP right now is we're going to contact the White House and members of Congress every day now. Statements are not working. Meetings are not working. The White House is saying certain things. They're saying we care about humanitarian aid. We're now on day 26, 27. Sorry, the people in Gaza can't wait. The people in North Gaza very, very soon are going to starve. We're hearing about, UNRWA and those who are doing development and humanitarian assistance are unable to help. They don't have the resources. And so what I wanted to talk about, and we'll share this, in a link. There was an article that came out, and this is a robust conversation. Jewish Currents is who published this article. It's an analysis. This was published by Raz Segal. Raz Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and genocide studies at Stockton University and an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide. My understanding is that he is an Israeli. Now, a progressive Israeli, okay? But the article is called A Textbook Case of Genocide. Israel has been explicit in what it's carrying out in Gaza. Why is the world not listening? And I challenge you to read this article. This article argues, and this is why I said I'm not speaking on behalf of CMEP right now, but I want us to ask the question, how do we stop any killing, any violence against civilians? What's happening in Gaza? Is it a genocide? And I think we will have a webinar talking about genocide, ethnic cleansing, what's happening in Gaza. I'd like to do that very soon. But this article talks about what's happening in Gaza. It talks about the number of deaths. It talks about the potential displacement of Gazans, if the border were opened up and people were allowed to leave to go to the Sinai. But this article defines the crime of genocide as the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, as noted in the December 48 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And, excuse me, he quotes the Israeli Minister of Defense, Gallant, who declared on October 9th. So this is the Israeli Minister of Defense who said, quote, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we will act accordingly," end quote. He goes on to say, leaders in the West reinforce this racist rhetoric by describing Hamas's mass murder of Israeli civilians, a war crime under international law that rightly provoked horror and shock in Israel and around the world, as an act of sheer evil, in the words of President Biden, or a move that reflected a, quote, ancient evil in the terminology of the president of the European Commission. And then he says, this dehumanizing language is clearly calculated to justify wide-scale destruction of Palestinian lives. The assertion of evil is absolutism. It elides distinctions between Hamas militants and Gazan civilians. Even President Biden has changed his rhetoric since the beginning of the war and said we must differentiate. Hamas is not Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The article goes on and talks about the 5 acts of genocide: killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. That's number 3. I can't find number 4 and number 5. I feel like the article might have lost its numbers. We will talk about this more. I'd encourage you to read this article. I'm not even sure. I'm not an expert on genocide, but I want to point out to you there's a response letter, a letter to the editor in response to this article in Jewish Currents that's called a letter in response to a textbook case of genocide. And this is written by Dov Waxman from Los Angeles, who's a professor of political science and Israel studies and the director of the UCLA Nazarene Center for Israel Studies. And I just want you to see what this letter to the editor says. Excuse me. He says, essentially, he says, I'll summarize. He says, Segal's argument's wrong. This isn't genocide. If Israel wanted to kill massive numbers of civilians, they would kill so many more, is what he argues. He says, so this is quoting the letter to the editor from Professor Waxman from UCLA. And he says, these actions don't amount to genocide, quote. They seemingly indiscriminate bombing of apartment buildings, civilian infrastructure in Gaza. It appears to be a war crime under international law, as does the forced displacement of civilians. And it's clear that some within the far-right Israeli government would like to seize this opportunity to drive Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip entirely, just as they hope to do with Palestinians in the West Bank in an act of mass ethnic cleansing. For our warnings about this frightening possibility to be taken seriously, we must avoid making unsubstantiated charges of genocide, end quote. My point of this is the professor that disagrees with the call of genocide doesn't argue that many, or at least some in the Israeli government are calling for ethnic cleansing. And my point of that is, call it genocide, call it ethnic cleansing. I don't care what you call it. Thousands of people are dying and it has to stop. And so I just would invite you, thank you so much. For those who are praying, we're saying stand in the gap, give, act, and pray. We are incredibly understaffed. Our budget is only at about $500,000. And so please give to organizations like ours, give to organizations that are doing direct humanitarian assistance, act, fill out our action alert. And now we're asking for more than that. If you can't do it every day by sending a note to your member of Congress, you have one representative and 2 senators, it's 3 letters. If you can't do that every day, commit to doing it once a week. Commit to once a week saying there's still not a ceasefire. Hundreds of Palestinian civilians are still dying. Jewish and international hostages are still being held by Hamas, and we want the U.S. to negotiate their release. We have to put more pressure on the U.S. government. The times are desperate. People are dying and suffering, often friends of people we know and love. And the U.S. is contributing. And so might we do all that we can, give, act, and pray, asking for God's intervention and calling for peace.